Hello, folks. This is Dr. King Mvemba, and welcome back to our channel, and in particular to the Intro to African History series. I emphasize that Intro to African History series because we do other videos on other Pan-African lectures on this channel as well. But this one in particular, this particular series is an Intro to African History. And I like to say that in case there's a to put sort of the level of discussion in context, which is why I often put my sources in the section below the video, because it's not supposed to be an all-encompassing video. It's not supposed to be particularly in-depth. It is an introduction to African history. This particular series is. We will have other videos as well that go more in depth about different topics, but this one is that. So without further ado, today we are talking about 19th century West Africa and the end of the slave trade and the transatlantic slave trade. This is a video that I've uploaded before, but if you saw the previous videos I uploaded, I told you I was going to re-upload this one because I felt that it had tried to do too much last time and had gone on to be too long. So I've actually split that previous video into two where I can focus on particular topics that I wanted to focus on. So right now we are focusing on 19th century West Africa with an emphasis on the end of the slave trade. Yeah, so let's go ahead and get started right away. All right, we're cooking with gas. All right. The video sequentially before this one had discussed the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade with the Portuguese settlers and Portuguese traders setting up plantations in Sao Tome and Principe, which are islands off the coast of West Africa. This is back in 1480. Then, after having tried that model for a while, other people were enslaved from West Africa to the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Then, after a while, they discovered that it would be, after trying out the Sao Tome and Principe model, which was a tropical island model, they realized, and with the discovery of the New World, right, the Americas, they discovered that they could do that sort of plantation over there in the Americas. So they started enslaving people from the coast of West Africa into enslavement in the Americas. This is all throughout the 16th century. Then, of course, the triangular trade developed. So make sure you watch that video that leads to this. So we've spoken about that. We've spoken about the suffering of the people, the loss of life, the destruction of culture, and we've also spoken about the impact on Africa, right, which was the socio-political and economic impact of the slave trade on the continent as well, which is a story that is often understated, as it is spoken of as Africans profiteered heavily off of the slave trade when it was really just the leaders, these unscrupulous leaders really who benefited from the slave trade and left vast portions of the continent suffering. And we explained those reasons in the previous video as well. So we're building from that, and now we take it up to the 18th century, late 18th century, and the beginning of the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So the bans to the slave trade begin towards the end of the 18th century. Beginning in 1780 onwards, there was the calls for abolition, and these things are getting louder and louder. And it's important here that we're talking about the end of the slave trade, not the institution of slavery itself, which would last for close to another century after that. But the slave trade, which that is to say, picking up, enslaving people from Africa and bringing them to the to the islands or to the quote unquote New World for the purposes of enslavement. There was push for that to end, which would necessarily mean the end of the slavery itself, as many people who were being born into slavery and these things that would continue as well. So these bans, based on the reasons we'll explain shortly, begin at the end of the 18th century with the northern U.S. states who had started banning the institution of slavery towards the end of the 18th century. We see in Denmark banned citizens from engaging in the trade in 1803. The U.S. officially banned its subjects in 1808 from engaging in the trade, and Netherlands 1814, and France had initially banned it in 1791, but then Napoleon reversed it, and they in 1802, then they finally banned it again in 1817. So you see these things are starting to happen in quick succession, these bans. Now, the bans, as I've said already, were bans to the slave trade. As you very well know, for example, in the US, even though the trade is banned in 1808, slavery would go on in the US until the Civil War in the 1860s, right? And some would argue that it just remanifests itself after that, but that's a different conversation. So what were the reasons for the end of the slave trade? So two reasons have arisen as being dominant. For a long time, the people just assumed that, or it was just widely accepted that it came about for humanitarian reasons. However, and we'll talk about the humanitarian case a bit later, but so the two main arguments, the first one we're talking about today is the economic argument for abolition. And like I said, the humanitarian one came first, but the economic one has garnered a lot more traction in recent years. And one of the big people who pushed for that was a Trinidadian scholar named Eric Williams, who put out this work in 1944. Fun fact, Eric Williams goes on to become the Prime Minister of Trinidad. But in which he argued that slavery was no longer economically viable, and that's why the imperial powers shied away from it or decided to move away from it. For example, with the introduction of modern technology, France, for example, was beginning to overproduce sugar from the Caribbean plantations, which meant that as they flooded the market, as you know, when you flood the market, things start to cost cheaper and cheaper, and it just wasn't sustainable anymore for its competitors who were still engaging in the slave trade. Because remember, enslaving people and the triangular trade is a very costly enterprise, and it just wasn't financially, economically sustainable anymore to keep doing that, especially with the advent of modern technology. Closely tied to that, the West African rulers and other kidnappers who had been capturing the people who would be sold into enslavement were now starting to charge higher and higher. Why is that? Well, one, they'd realized how important their quote unquote commodity was, but also as different as the population was getting decimated in the continent, and groups were starting to get their defenses up after they had caught wise of the nature of the slave trade and the news of the horrors people were experiencing as they went across to the Americas, as they went across the Atlantic, as they were becoming commonplace. People were getting more, communities were arming themselves more and preparing for battle. All that means that it was more costly now for these kidnappers to kidnap. They were having to invest more resources, they were fighting harder, and there were just like far less people to be kidnapping, right? Because they had created this scarcity, this gap in the population by over the centuries of enslavement. So, supply and demand, the cost was getting higher for them. Because the plantation owners were paying more and more for slaves, they were unable to pay off their debts to the banks, and the banks were starting to shy away from that. Furthermore, right, because the banks were not getting paid now, the European banks were not getting paid, the planters were not paying off their debts, they start investing in a nascent industrial era, right? People, the manufacturing age has started. It's not as big as it is going to be by the end of the 19th century, but it has started, and they're realizing now that you can invest more in factories, in these warehouses for industrial production, for manufacturing, and it may be more lucrative than the slave trade at this point. So that's banks as well. Then finally, with the idea of the Industrial Revolution being on the precipice of happening, these traders and the banks and pretty much the European imperialists realized that it may be more profitable for them to not remove labor from Africa, but to keep labor in Africa. That way, that labor can be used to extract raw materials, iron, copper, gold, even cotton and these other things from the continent itself, right? So that those raw materials can now be shipped to either the US or to Europe, where they will be used in the new industries. Okay, so that would be beneficial to them, because now they can then manufacture these goods, and it would give them, they would win twice over, right? Which is what I mean by would actually benefit the Europeans twice. Living Africans in Africa would actually benefit the Europeans twice, because they would have people to extract the resources, as well as when they manufacture the goods, they could sell them back to the continent at exponentially higher prices. So they would also have a market for their goods, after they manufactured them, which would have been tough to do if folks had if they continued uprooting the communities from Africa. So that's one. The second thing is, so that's the humanitarian, the economic argument in a nutshell. The humanitarian case has also been made, and it's the one that is more on the nose, where abolitionists were pushing and pushing. We can talk about the Quakers in North America, the likes of Wilberforce, these sort of leaders, William Wilberforce, who led a very prominent abolitionist campaign in Britain. The Quakers we spoke about already, and other groups that were just saying that the horrors of the slave trade had now become apparent, especially as tied to the advent of Christian missionary culture, where there was this shift to believing that the souls of these barbarians, quote unquote, was redeemable if we could send Christian missionaries to those areas. So there was this shift in the humanitarian in humanitarian cases. So there's a debate on which of the two arguments was the more influential in bringing. Was it the humanitarian case? Was the Damascus Road moment, to which people realized that this was wrong? Or was it the economic argument? And there's a back and forth on that. I'll let you look into that yourself a little more. But I just, it's important to remember that those are the two camps, if you will, that try to explain the end of the slave trade. Now, in all this, when we talk about the two camps, one series of events is often understated. And this is typical, right? Which is, if you want to talk about the erasure of African agency, I advise that you go back to my video on why we approach things from an Afrocentric worldview. So the Africans themselves are often left out. It is as if, if the economic argument or the humanitarian argument were happening, it is as if the decisions were being made for them. But actually, the Africans themselves, both on the continent and in the New World, put up serious resistance to slavery as well, right? So, what are some of these forms of resistance? First of all, we can talk about the hundreds and thousands who died by jumping overboard during the transatlantic slave trade, who, in a line now made famous by the movie Black Panther, when Killmonger talks about how his ancestors would have preferred to die than to live in bondage. That was a real thing. A lot of people would throw themselves overboard, and Equiano, Olaudah Equiano, who we'll talk about shortly, writes about this, where he saw his countrymen jump overboard by the numbers, right, as resistance. They were not going to serve these masters. They were not going to live in bondage and in enslavement. So a lot of them committed suicide. Other African people who had been enslaved became scholarly and allied themselves with the abolitionist movements and wrote extensively about their experiences, and even wrote to governments and the likes in a bid to attain their freedom. For example, Otoba Kugoano wrote to the British Naval Squadron to ask them to patrol the West African waters to suppress the slave trade. Even though he wrote about this in 1787, and it wasn't another 30 years before this happened. But you can tell that he was ahead of his time in petitioning even the enslaving governments to push back against the trade, as did Olaudah Equiano, who was prominent in the late 18th century, right on the front end of these abolitionist movements, right? So it wasn't that just the Quakers and these are the white European folks or white American folks who were seeking to save the slaves, right? The enslaved people themselves were prominent in that. And if that is more mild, we can look as well as at such groups as the Palmares of Brazil and the Maroons of Jamaica, who set up autonomous communities within the territories that they had been enslaved in a bid to avoid the oppressive hand of the slave masters. The Palmares were runaway slaves that set up an independent republic in Brazil, which lasted for about 100 years before it was overcome by the Portuguese. 100 years of an independent Black republic in Brazil, right? In Jamaica, the Maroons gathered in the Central Highlands, where they established their own self-governing farming community, which survived frequent attempts by the government to suppress them. So you get these things. Then, of course, in addition to that, to these self-governing communities that Black people or people of African descent were establishing in the New World, you also get the revolts, and we can talk all day about the likes of Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey. Look at even the very existence of the Underground Railroad as a form of revolt, right, in the USA. And none of these is as famous or as influential as the Haitian Revolution, led by the gentleman depicted here, Toussaint Louverture, which the uprising happened began in 1791, in which in Haiti, or Saint-Domingue as it was known at the time, where in a in a miscalculated move by the enslavers, they had brought so many slaves that the island itself now had 400,000 enslaved people, while there was only tens of thousands European people. So, inspired by the events of the French Revolution, Toussaint Louverture and his band of other enslaved people began to rebel and beat off invasions by the French and the British navies and established the Independent Republic of Haiti, which was the first Black republic to be established in this sort of new world and in this modern era, as well as the, Haiti has gone on to pay severely for that by way of alienation in the Western Hemisphere, but we can talk about that further. But it's important to know that the Haitian Revolution would go on to inspire other revolutions around the Americas as well. And when we talk about Pan-Africanism to this day, a lot of scholars trace some of its early influences to the Haitian Revolution. So that was very, very big. And in all this, it is also important to recognize that different African groups were becoming the wiser as well on the continent. Even some of the rulers who had previously, who even if they continued to ally themselves with the enslavers, there was a large awakening happening as we got into the 19th century. For example, King Agaja of Benin, I believe, tried to petition because at that point their kingdom was very dependent on the income from the slave trade. He tried to petition the Portuguese and other enslavers to set up plantations within Africa itself, so that way his people would not have to leave the continent, right? So it sounds callous, to an extent, but it does show that the Africans are starting to struggle with this idea of where were these people going, where were their fellow Africans, even if they were from different groups, different clans and different groups, where were they going to? And they were starting to see the impact, the deficit of manpower and community was having on the continent itself. Another example is Queen Nzhinga, the famous Queen Nzhinga of modern day Angola, of the Kongo Angola region, who pushed back again from, even though still engaging in the slave trade, but pushed back from Portuguese overreach to a point whereby she actually fought with them in a bid to put a limit to how much control they had as they continued with their slave trade. So you get these examples of even leaders on the African continent and who were starting to push back against the increasingly apparent horrors of the slave trade. Well, for a long time, essentially for the past 3 centuries, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade as an institution had been the overwhelming industry in West Africa. However, as part of the trade, some of the things that they received from the Americas were maize and cassava, maize, corn, right, and cassava. And farmers receiving that as part of the slave trade had become very, very efficient in farming these two categories. So they were also increasingly solid in farming. Of course, these communities have been farming communities way before then, thousands of years prior to that, but they're also becoming proficient in these starches around which communities continue to grow. Which made the transition, although it was a rough transition from the West African kingdom to engaging in the slave trade, it made it a little bit easier as they started to get into farming as well as to other industries, so that by the mid-19th century, West African commodities had overtaken the slave trade. These commodities included gum arabic, which was a prominent commodity out of Senegal, groundnuts as well uh, from Guinea, palm oil from most of the forest areas in West Africa, uh, and the and gold was back. You know, the Asante community had been prominent for its gold. Actually, that the colonial name of Ghana is known as gold. It was the Gold Coast, but and again, this had been going on back then, even with the Ghanaian Empire from a few centuries prior. But with the advent of the slave trade, that had fallen back, taken a back seat to slavery. So now it was resurgent with as the slave trade ended. However, the biggest commodity out of West Africa was palm oil, pictured here. It continues to be a very important product to this day. But it was produced by the Igbo people, which, by the way, Olauna Equiado, we spoke about, had come originally from Igbo land as well. So it was produced by the Igbo people and transported by the Ijo people, who now, they are both had previously been used to transport captured people for enslavement, but now they were now repurposed for transporting things like palm oil. However, conniving as ever, the British sought to eliminate the middlemen in this relationship. So they tried to set up their own transportation and deal directly with the Igbo, which of course fermented conflict between the Igbo and the Ijo people. Classic divide and conquer tactics, very synonymous with the European imperialists. So, but palm oil at that point was the biggest unmatched crop export that was coming out of West Africa. It was used in industrial Europe for manufacture of soap, and in the early part of the century as a lubricant for industrial machinery before petroleum oil. So throughout the 19th century, it was very, very important. How, you know, for saying all this, if the slave trade had not really benefited, strengthened African economies, you know, this dynamic continued even with these goods, right? They continued to benefit the rulers. The rulers were getting richer and richer, but the economies as a whole were not benefiting. For example, they would trade these goods, gold, palm oil, all types of foodstuffs, gum, Arabic, and rubber, and these things. And they would often get things like cloth, alcohol, and firearms. That sounds decent, right? Well, no, it was actually detrimental to African economy because for these reasons, you get cloth. Now, West Africa already prior to this had a vibrant textile industry. And if you know anything about the textile industry, it is one of the industries that is easier to establish and to maintain. So if it's by that, it means that even poorer people can get involved in it with some ease. But when you flood the market with cloth and textiles from an industrializing Europe and America, you pretty much deem this economy irrelevant, right? And you know, you deem it non-existent, and people lose out on their income that way. So that's cloth. It pretty much destroyed the developing textile industries in West Africa. Alcohol is, and I love a good drink as much as the next man. But for it to be an important currency within the trade, it is not necessarily a beneficial societal commodity, right? You get it, you drink it, you might sell it, people drink it, and it's not a beneficial good that can be leveraged in the way that if you sell them gold or palm oil that they now use to oil or to lubricate their machines and make soap, which can be, you know, so it just was lopsided. Plus, the masses still didn't get it. It was something that really benefited the aristocracy and in their pursuit of leisure. Then firearms, the kings would often get firearms in this trade. Now the firearms were who would they be used on, right? So the firearms were always obsolete uh, by European standards or by industrializing standards. So it means they could not be used against the European settlers, the European traders themselves, because they would already have like newer ones. So they could only be used on fellow Africans, right? So these obsolete weapons would only lead to a more militarized West African landscape, in which they could oppress, in which the leaders could oppress more people, because now they had these firearms, but firearms that would not have been beneficial to them at all when they would push back against colonialism or imperial overreach. So this is the nature of, so in a nutshell, um, the trade itself, even after the end of the slave trade, the trade of goods hardly ever benefited the African communities themselves. So if we're talking about West Africa and the end of the slave trade, I think there are two communities here that are pretty interesting to talk about. One of them, the first one being Sierra Leone. Now, Sierra Leone was created to solve the problem of unemployed Black people in Britain. This is when the British had fought against America in the American War of Independence. Several Black people had fought on the side of the British, and with the U.S. winning, and established their independence, a lot of these Black people were now resettled in Nova Scotia, in modern-day Canada. And they were with lavish promises of land and freedom. However, in time, and many of them had also gone to England, hoping to find better treatment, but only found themselves still poor and unemployed. So they started this call by the British abolitionist movement led by Olaudah Equiano and others to see if they could repatriate to Africa and set up a new independent nation based on the values of Christianity and civilization. So it was a pseudo-civilizing mission itself. So the British government was like, okay, and they sent 411 people in 1787 to repatriate in Sierra Leone. But it was an ill-fated journey. Half of them died on the trip, and most of them were dead by 1790 due to illness and conflict with some of the local inhabitants, right? However, the British communities continued to push for this, and by 1792, a further 1,200 Black people were convinced to go settle in Sierra Leone, followed by 500 more in 1795, and some of these were actually the Jamaican Maroons we spoke about earlier. So, and in all this time, so finally some semblance of a community was developing there, but under the rule of the Sierra Leone Company. The Sierra Leone Company was exactly as it sounds, was a company, right? Which ran the colony and appointed its governors. So the the African people who had repatriated there had very few freedoms. They were still being run by this company. We'll talk more about company rule when we get to the section where we talk about the scramble for Africa, but it's exactly as it sounds. It would be the equivalent of Amazon getting some territory somewhere and essentially just running a government there, right? So this would last from the 1790s until 1808, when the British government took over the settlement from the company and it became a crown colony. So that's a little bit of the story about Sierra Leone. Most of the citizens there had originally come from modern day Nigeria. So they were mostly Yoruba and Igbo people. And, they had gone back with these values of strongly anglicized values of Christianity and these things. So they were they treated the African people, the people who had never left Africa, with some of the colonial disdain that the white people did, because they had been anglicized and had been bought into the idea of the civilizing mission. So some of these Creoles who resettled treated some of the natives with that same attitude. And they would also go on to lead some of the major intellectual developments, including founding Samuel Ajayi Crowther, who was one of the founders of several schools, and was the first African missionary in West Africa. These sort of people, right? And we'll talk about some of them in the next slide when we start to talk about Christian missionaries on the continent. Now, Liberia neighbors Sierra Leone, so their stories are similar, if with some significant differences. Liberia was founded in 1822 by freed African Americans who were repatriated. So Sierra Leone by British, by black people from the British communities, but Liberia, founded a little bit later by freed African Americans who were being freed as slavery started to wound down. It was organized by the American Colonization Society, which was a body of white Americans who believed that the increasing number of freed African Americans in the southern states made it harder to keep the other black people around them in slavery. So it was not benevolent, right? It was not benevolent. It was like, we need to get rid of some of these black people. It was that, well, why don't you go back to Africa, come to life? And a lot of the African people, or the black people in freed African American slaves, were only too happy to oblige, because there was no love in the spaces they were in. So many of them settled, repatriated to what is modern day Liberia. And although originally organized by American whites, educated blacks soon took over the administration of the settlement. And in 1847, they declared the colony the Independent Republic of Liberia, with the word itself meaning Liberia coming from the term liberty, right? Liber in Latin, meaning freedom. And the capital is actually called Monrovia, based on James Monroe, who was president of the U.S. at the time. And even if you see their flag, it resembles an American flag, but with just one star. So such was Liberia, and much like Sierra Leone, also created several intellectual juggernauts, some of whom we will talk about again in our next episode. But see, Liberia is very interesting because these, what we call Americo-Liberians, these repatriated freed African American slaves, soon dominated all aspects of the socio-political life, to such an extent that from the time of its founding until the late 20th century with Samuel Doe, when Samuel Doe became president, all the people who had led the country were of the Americo-Liberian lineage, including the likes of the Tolberts and then the Tubmans, many of them who would come back and get educated in the USA for college, then go back and rule the country. So they also created a hierarchical structure between the Americo-Liberians and the indigenous populations, if you will. And I know the country has come a long way in sort of destroying those boundaries, but for a good almost 200 years, it operated with those dynamics. And these are things that we can go into further depth in the future. There are also a lot of good YouTube videos that detail this. I will share some of the links below the video. So that's a little bit about Sierra Leone and Liberia. Okay, so we've been there. So what are some of the key takeaways from from this episode. The two main arguments for abolition, we spoke about the two main arguments, be able to articulate their nuances, right? One, one on this side and the other on the side, be able to articulate their various nuances. Africans are often denied agency when we talk about the end of the slave trade, the abolition of the slave trade, or and the resistance thereof. So be sure to be able to articulate the various ways in which Black people, either on the continent or in the New World, resisted enslavement. And I know that I probably didn't even account for all of them. I definitely didn't account for all of them. So be sure to explore further and find other ways that people resisted enslavement, right? All the dynamics, all the horrors of enslavement. Imported 19th century West African commodities, when the move was made away from the transatlantic slave trade, what goods and commodities were important to the communities. We spoke about several of them: gum arabic, palm oil, groundnuts, and other things. So just be able to articulate those as well. Why did trade not benefit the West African nations, or the West African, I won't even call them nations at this point, maybe nations, but the West African communities? They would often only benefit the leaders, but the economies at large did not benefit significantly. And finally, which communities founded Liberia and Sierra Leone respectively? We explained what groups led to the founding. And when we talk about founding, this is not in that colonial sense where you discover people who were already there, but we're talking about the establishing of these countries as modern day republics, right? What groups established them as modern day republics? That's what we're talking about. So yes, that's our lesson for this week. We will continue before the end of this week. I'll upload the other video that was the second part of the video we are re-uploading with this, and that is focusing on Christian missionaries and the rise of Christian missionary culture within Africa from the 18th century onwards. So thank you so much for joining me. And if you like this channel, be sure to share it, like, subscribe. Let's see if we can make this a thing, and let's learn about Africa. I will see you guys soon. Thank you very much.